everyone, and welcome to Sphere of Success, where we look at challenge and adversity in business and how we can look at that as a positive step forward, where we can look at self-development analysis, where we can think about how our business is being optimized, because sometimes the challenges we face can be the best opportunities for growth and making sure that when we look back, we think, actually, you know what, that could be really useful. So there's inevitability of these issues that can actually lead to greater progress. And with this in mind, things happen, and they're certainly never necessarily something that we feel that we control. And one of those is bereavement and loss and life-changing events. And today we have an absolutely superb guest, Celia Conrad. She is a relationship expert, highly qualified in all of her disciplines. She's a best-selling author and coach. She is a speaker. She assists businesses, CEOs, and HR managers. She also helps well-being teams within business so that they can put things in place to help employees and indeed themselves in leadership roles, uh, things which will actually help when life's unforeseen challenges come our way and we can be left bereft, we can be in the midst of a divorce, we can have a miscarriage, whatever it might be, and that our business is taking care of us, that we know that we've got people who are there to support us in the right way. So, Celia, welcome. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
One of the things I'd like to go into is the fact that these life-changing events happen within a blink of an eye. You can go going to work to one morning, get a call, and all of a sudden your family is in disarray. How can you help business be resilient and future-proof itself, knowing that that could actually set the business into turmoil?
Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And of course, a lot of it depends upon the size of the organization because it's very often smaller businesses that are really impacted by the loss of a key player. So if you have, say, a situation where someone is not in the office because they've suffered a bereavement or something's happened to them, then how does that organization cover that work that that person, was doing? So in a smaller organization, it can often be a mad panic as to who's actually going to do that and cover. In a larger organization, it might be easier in the sense if there are other people who could step in, but it's still going to put a lot of strain on co-workers. And so it's like, well, in terms of contingency plans, it's not, this is an interesting scenario because it's not one in the sense that you have an insurance policy for in the sense of, if someone's not there. So for example, I don't know if you have a team, you have a football team, you've got people on the side that you can always bring in. So you've got that backup, don't you? You have the players, then you've got other people. So if you are a major player in, say, a law firm, then what would generally happen is that that work's going to get allocated to other members of staff. And then, of course, at some point, if there's too much, they might have to think about recruiting somebody else. So there's, stress on co-workers. There is obviously managing clients on that basis. And then, of course, there's also how you deal with the person who's had those issues and then how you're going to think about it short term, medium term, and long term. Because some of these issues are not really short term, they could have major ripple effects, moving forward. So there's a lot of, again, variables and a lot of factors to take into consideration when you're actually considering that. But it is still something that needs to be in the forefront of an employer's mind as opposed to in the background because it's like, oh, that will never happen. Well, you don't know that.
Mm.
And you have to think about what would be my contingency plan if this person wasn't there. I mean, I had it when I worked for a smaller law firm where I mean the work was reallocated, but the workload then became, and I mean it was impossible to do it all. So that's one of the big things that has to be thought about, and as to whether there is the capability and the structure to deal with that. Because
Mm.
if you think about a very small business where there's just a couple of people, if someone wasn't there and they really are a key part or a partnership or whatever, it's going to make it, I mean, the impact's going to be huge. As I say, in a massive organization with thousands of staff, it's not going to be so detrimental when you bring in a locum, in a law firm to do work, but you still have to think about it and you still have to budget for it.
And with regards to that, let's say, for instance, this person is the key person, and you're thinking, right, we're really suffering here as a business because they're not in. How can you then take the approach of compassion, but also the fact that you have a commercial business to run? How can you bridge that gap and make sure that you've got an effective outcome?
Well, I mean, when there's something like that happens, it obviously is going to be a very difficult decision for an employer. They will obviously want to, if that's someone's had a loss and they're going to wait again, it's going to depend how long is that person going to be away for. Because if this is a key player, is there any other work? Can that work be reallocated among other people in a short term? Is that is that workable? If it's going to be longer, is it going to be sustainable? And down the line, is it really going to be effective at all? Because it's going to have a huge impact on the business. Now, obviously, there is a duty of care to employees. So an employer has to be very considerate of someone who has this and has to actually do what they can to accommodate them. But they also then have to think about other ways of dealing with it when that person's not there. And then, of course, down the line, it depends what happens. Because when that specific event happens, you don't know at that point how long that person might be away for and how much it's going to impact. Because generally with these losses and things like absence from, it's amazing how someone who is such a key player, no one really realizes how much they do until they're not there. And then when they realize, wow, actually they were doing this, we now need to think about maybe recruiting other people, say getting other people in to do it, and shifting things around. Now, of course, then you're having to manage that employers or employees, should I say, employees' absence, but also the co-workers and your care to them to make sure that, because otherwise you've had the loss of that person, and then you've got the obviously the anxiety within, say, a team for losing that person, and then the extra work and how it's going to impact them. And it's a fine balance.
And what happens when that person is somebody who is at the upper end of the business, the leader of the business, or in senior management?
Well,
Because
that,
we've got
yeah,
that in the employees sort of thing, and we're thinking
yes.
about the general workforce. But let's say, for instance, somebody's on the executive committee.
Mm.
What happens then?
Well, again, I mean that if someone who's making strategic decisions, this is why this needs to be some forward thinking, because if you have an organization and you have that scientist set up and you know there are key players, if one of them wasn't there, how would you manage without them? What would you do? What contingency plans would you put in place? How would you deploy the decision making on things they were doing to somebody else? One thing which is a slight deviation from your question, but was actually quite interesting, is that have a CEO, ironically, who has been through one of these very life challenging situations, changed a significant number of policies within the organization after experiencing a loss himself and realizing what his employees were actually going through and what he could do to help in terms of putting things into place so that there were people who could support and how they would cover for other people if they did have to have time off work. And I think it's, as you said, we talk about obviously the employees always at the grassroots level almost, but it's up the hierarchy that's, even if you're at the top, you could be impacted, and you will then realize actually how people who are working with you or for you are also impacted, and then make changes. And it's amazing actually, if I've spoken to people who have had a loss or something has happened to them, much more open to, yes, actually, this is something we need to put into place. And I was thinking about this because this happened to me or my family or whatever. And it's amazing actually then because it's that cultural change, because I think this is also very important. If the actual, we talk about cultures of workplaces, but actually the culture of the people who are in charge, how they feel about certain issues will obviously have that ripple effect in the organization in terms of how open they are to actually dealing with certain issues such as loss and life-changing events, and what they're prepared to pay to obviously, put into it.
And with regards to the policy that one has for bereavement in the time off that's needed
Mm,
within the company's policy, we're all different. And bereavement isn't necessarily, oh, that person has passed away and that's it. What would you say to an employer who has a member of their team, employee, that's lost a member of the family, but the time that they've got to take off within the company's policy
mm.
is not going to be fit for purpose?
No, that's the thing, because there with the actual, there's no statutory sort of time off, and it sort of can be, it's quite varies from say maybe a few days to maybe a couple of weeks, that the employer who discretionary compassionate sort of leave that they might give to somebody. There were obviously plans to change things in the last government going through, with obviously giving more time off for grief, but it is very much still discretionary. But there's still also that point that the employer has a duty of care to employees. So if you do not, so if you say for example somebody is struggling and they're not able to be there, or they can't perform at their best because of that loss, and it's not really recognised by an employer, and they don't get that care from the employer, they could then, sort of bring a case for, unfair dismissal, constructive dismissal, saying that basically it was because of these actions I had to leave, and various things, or you're discriminating against me, all these various things that could happen, because it's like, what is a disability? And we start getting to legal jargon. I'm not an employment lawyer, but obviously I can touch on those things. But those are all things I always say to employers: you need to think about your duty of care, but you also need to think about your legal obligations under employment law, and that you do have a duty to obviously, you know, your employees. So those are things that they need to factor in. It's like, being more flexible about time off, and also thinking about maybe we could do a job share or reduced hours, or perhaps somebody could work from home for a few days, because, making phone calls, doing things that you have to do, you can't do them in an office, especially if you're an open plan office. So it's accommodations, it's looking at that particular employee, and also if you value that employee as well and they're a good member of staff, and thinking about, well, what could we do to accommodate, and also getting co-workers on board as well, because it's like you don't want them to think, oh, this person's being favored. You have to think about how you're, I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of moving parts with this, but it's just being very practical, but also being sensitive. And that's really important.
Yes. And how does that disparity of assistance, because as you say, things like this, they're not all the same. There's different variables. How can you make sure that within a leadership role, the team knows that no, favoritism isn't being given to a certain individual. It's actually our policy to take each on a case by case basis.
Yes, I mean, I think you would have a general framework for a policy. So you'd have general principles that, if this happens, this is kind of like their protocols that they would have, so someone would know that they would need to follow. But then you have that discretionary basis in terms of, say, you have someone who needs to have time off, or you have to look at that individual, because otherwise it's too rigid. There has to be, it's fine having rules and regulations, but it's one of those things where it has to be a little bit fluid because of the nature of what we're dealing with.
And with regards to the impact on a business, absenteeism, in the worst scenario, leaving a job, what kind of impact is that going to have on the business?
Well, it's huge because the reality is, if you actually think about it, if you first of all, if you have someone who is obviously not performing very well, or there are issues, then yes, you would have work performance and productivity. So that's going to be, and then presenteeism when someone's obviously there, but they're not really there because they're thinking about other things. So that's obviously going to start to have an impact. But then if you do have people who say, good employees who don't feel supported who leave, that's going to start having a massive impact. Then you've got deployment of work, putting more pressure on other people, thinking about recruiting, retraining, costs. Costs go up, productivity goes down. And also, if you're seen as an employer who doesn't care, that doesn't give you a very good reputation. And then people will not want to start to work for that employer. So you have to think about the balance between, yes, we're running a commercial enterprise, but also employees are our business because without them, we can't run that business. You need to invest in your employees. Happy employees who feel supported and cared for are more likely to stay. And more people want to work. You'll actually attract quality you'll attract the talent for people who want to work for you, as opposed to people who actually, will leave and then go elsewhere.
And so, thinking about a robust policy, how can you instill into an organization something which is effective on a non kind of you can't really prescribe X and Y. How do you help this in an organic way to actually give people the guidelines and the principles to be able to flex that when needed?
Yes, so again, it's all about raising awareness and training. So if you have a well-being policy, which most large organizations would have, and then you have a little part of that, a niche of that is about loss, about what happens in terms of loss. You want to be able to you need to be able to signpost people to that. So one of the things really in terms of, because well-being now is such a big thing, particularly after lockdown, and mental health, because whereas before an employer might not have considered it so much, now you do have to. So when you're actually even onboarding employees, you should be talking about these are all the things, and pointing people to things if you have these issues, and these are the people that you can go to, so they are aware of that. You need to have it somewhere on your firm or your organization's website where people can find information and extra resources, and also people maybe they could talk to if they need to, which is very important. And also even just like doing a national, like they have national wellness and awareness weeks and all these various things, and there are some organizations which will have, literally they'll have a well-being week, and then they'll have people coming in talking about things, they get people involved, and the employees come on to the sessions and hear things, so that they kind of have that support to show that they know what to do or who to go to if something like this happened for them. Because that's the thing, because a lot of it is like, well, who do I tell? Oh, that my employer doesn't care. They're not my friend, they're just my employer, so they're not going to help me, they don't care. So they need to know that there's actually someone, or they're worried about losing their job if they say. So they need to know there's some support there, that they can actually go to somebody and talk about it, and they can be signposted, because signposting is also very important, because you might not have if you're a small organization, you're not going to have, and if you're a very big organization, you probably have got the big HR, and you may have a well-being officer in there, and you'll have someone who understands about the policies and protocols, and you can talk to them, and they'll know. In a smaller organization, they may not have that because they don't have that capacity to do that. But then you want to be able to signpost people, even to external, supporters or suppliers, so that you know that your employees have someone they can actually go to, so that you can actually be covered for that. So you've obviously considered that might happen, and they might need that support. And it's very specific support, because I want to talk about EAPs here, because you have obviously organizations which have those external providers as part of employee package, but often it's very generic as opposed to specific in terms of the loss element, where people want to speak to someone who really doesn't understand about grief or divorce or any other life transitions like me. But basically that's the reality.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? A lot of employees, and I'd like you to now delve into the point of the employee's perspective, is one, you don't want to burden people. And secondly, you don't want to be coming across as somebody that is falling apart
No, and
or that you
that,
feel
yes, it's,
ashamed.
yes, exactly, because you can have a situation where you want everybody who is in charge of a team or a manager to be aware of these things, but it is a huge responsibility to expect that manager to become the counselor, because they have their day-to-day job, they're managing a team, they can't do everything. That's It's very unfair on them to do that. So, but if they have that awareness, they also can signpost to people as well. So maybe that might be within the organisation, but also that particular employee, as you say, may not wish to discuss it with someone in that organisation. They don't want anyone there to know about what's going on or what they might be feeling, and they don't feel comfortable about that. So that's where sort of they having external providers, say such as myself, where they can be referred to someone who actually can help them, so that they don't have that within the organisation, and no one knows about it. So it's not like anybody or their colleagues know what's happening, which is better for them. And
Well,
as I
that's
say,
very
many
interesting then. So they wouldn't be referred to you necessarily. Yours is a number or however they contact you to be in touch, which is completely confidential. Let's say, for instance, your boss or the leadership team
yes,
know that you'd been in touch with you. It's just as an
yes,
employee's decision, actually, I'm
exactly,
going to contact Celia
yes.
and that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, so they then wouldn't have any of their, any information. It wouldn't be divulged to anyone within that organization. So it's like an employee benefit that they can use. But again, it keeps it confidential, and a lot of employees feel better about that, as opposed to having to talk to someone, because yes, you talk to your manager about work, but you don't want to talk to them necessarily about how you're feeling about what's happened, about something that's happened to you.
It's
It's very,
deeply
very
personal
different.
and it can be very uncomfortable.
Exactly. Then yes, in terms of the working relationship,
Mm.
exactly.
Because afterwards, you still have to work with that person.
Well,
And
precisely.
then they know, and then you never know if somebody else is going to find out. You'd like to think it was
Exactly.
confidential, but you just never know who says what to whom, do you?
No, exactly. And it's even, because let's face it, if someone's I think when I was working at the bank, and I was the team lead, my manager said to me, "Oh, well, somebody who you don't know, Celia, because he was here before you arrived, but he'd lost his wife, and sudden death. Literally had come downstairs one morning, and she had died, of a brain aneurysm, and so he obviously hadn't been into the office for quite a few months, and then they were moving him around in terms of teams. They thought they'll put him into my team, and so people coming up to him on that first day asked, and you could see he was quite emotional, and then interestingly enough, he asked to talk to me outside of that office environment, which is really interesting. And that's part of the reason, in some ways, and I am thinking about now why I do what I do. And I'd had a few instances of this with another one of my colleagues who'd had a terrible miscarriage before, and was terrified of anybody knowing that she was pregnant, because of the fact if she had this miscarriage again. So having to conceal that from my other members of the team are wondering why is she maybe getting preferential treatment and what is Celia doing here managing workloads, is an example of I've kind of seen it in action as someone who's managed staff like that. So it's workable. You can do it. But I think, but it's really interesting. They do want that confidentiality. And there are some people, you might have a manager you feel you can talk to, but you might have one you feel you can't talk to. So if you're told to speak to your manager, it may not happen.
And the
And
other
that's the
thing is as
thing.
well, you don't know, but domestic abuse or something like that, where you're going to have to leave the home environment for your own safety. That's not necessarily something that you want to discuss at work.
No, and the thing is, that's a really interesting point because there's a lot more now emphasis on employers in terms of the having employees who are, suffering domestic abuse and awareness about that and how you deal with that. It's obviously one of the areas I work with obviously people who have been through abuse as well. And often in the workplace, there's several things. Sometimes they might not be able to come to work. It depends on the scenario. They could be prevented by coming to work by an abuser, or going to work is their only escape from the abuser.
Mm.
And then the workplace is also where someone and they, so stalking or so many different things, so many scenarios with that as well. So that is a very big area in terms of, you know, private, personal, confidential, very sensitive, and awareness of what might happen.
I think that, when you're dealing with these very sensitive and difficult issues, that to have that outsider, to have that opportunity to take it out of, but in a professional setting, out of the company in that sense, and have that confidentiality. And for all concerned, is when you tell somebody something, they know it then, and they're left
Yes,
with that burden
exactly.
of receiving that information. It's like, well, what do I do with this now?
Mm.
And I've been put in that situation um, where you think, well, what can I do now? What would be incumbent upon me now that I know this information? Well, what happens if it were to escalate? And I didn't say anything because that person held me to a confidence.
Yes, yes, it makes it very difficult. Whereas it's very,
Absolutely.
very different the in what you're working with someone outside of that context. Obviously, I mean, I'm also doing therapy now, and it's like you have that therapeutic alliance with clients. So you're building that. You've got to build rapport. You're building trust. You're thinking about goals and tasks and how they can help themselves, but how you can guide them and facilitate changes that they want to make. And really you're working with them so they can try and get through that process, and I'm not saying as quickly as possible, but particularly with grief, because there is no timeline, but it's so they can manage it. Because I always say, we don't move on, we move forward, but it's how you move forward. And if you can, if you feel your support as an employee and you get that support, you'll be a much better employee for it.
Well, I looking at circumstances as many years ago, I had a relationship with a gentleman who worked for a company where he had to fill up his works vehicle with quite high ticket items, and he was accosted in the car park and held up by gunpoint to so that they could rob the materials. Well, that in a sense wasn't anything to do with me, but he rang me from the police station saying what had happened. And I immediately, without even asking, I just said, "So I've got to go and I've got to go now." And I always remember thinking, I need to talk to somebody because this was such a massive shock. But that wasn't available back then. This was many years ago. Um, and that kept with, I didn't want him to go to work. I didn't want him to drive around in that vehicle because I thought, well, if it's happened once, they'll know that it's an easy target because they got away with the goods. And I think oddly enough, it affected me more than it did
Yes.
him because he worked through it and he was, it was fine. I'm not saying it wasn't awful, but it was the fact that he'd given me this knowledge and there wasn't anything I could do with it.
No. And I think
So,
that's a really interesting one, Deborah, because it's also like when things like that happen to us, it's like, why did that trigger us so much? What else was going on in our life, or what has happened to us before that maybe makes us even more sensitive to that happening? So it's a really interesting scenario, but I think feeling helpless and not being able to do something is actually not a great place to be.
mm, yes,
And
I've
I think people,
also worked in a banking situation where every now and again, I think it's got a lot better. And again, this is a number of years ago, that there would be people who would hold people up at gunpoint in the banks. Now, I've never been in that situation again, but you hear of people who have, and that impacts everybody on so many different levels. The customers and the people who work there and also their immediate families, etc. And so somebody like yourself, I know that this is, life-changing events. I don't think these things need to be underestimated because a lot of people say, oh, pull yourself together. People could have lost their lives. And that does
absolutely.
impact different people with
Well, it's
different
this trauma. It's trauma, isn't it? It's
personalities, different. Yeah.
PTSD. I mean, it's trauma. It's like witnessing things. It's traumatic. And then depending on what's happened to you previously, it could trigger even other things. And then you have very adverse reactions to
Or
other
you go past a
scenarios.
car accident, of a significant car accident on the motorway, and that can be incredibly shocking
Mm.
if it's something which, you hadn't thought that you would see or experience
No,
in that way. So,
no.
if somebody like yourself who is there, who can take things, because again, if you go to work and you think they're going to think I'm nuts if I start talking about this,
Mm.
because it's just like, well, people are not going to see it in the way that I saw it.
But
So,
it's subjective and
yeah.
it's how it impacts you. And that's anything, any loss is like that. And that's the thing. It's the feelings that you have are the feelings that you have, and you have to be able to work through those feelings and process them. And it's if you don't, it's actually it's unhealthy. And that's the thing. It's like, stuffing down emotions, not dealing with things actually will come back on people down the line. They think it doesn't, but it does. And suddenly the other things happen, and then you get more reactions to things. And then, as you say, you're not dealing with it. It's like layering on.
Mm.
But it's amazing the things that you actually, as you say, if you witness something or you see something, it will impact you.
And the other thing is a loss of a pet.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And I had a boss once and it was devastating. And he went, well, it's just a dog. And I'm sure a lot of people would resonate with that in the fact that our animals,
They become members of the family.
absolutely. So to lose a pet can be totally devastating.
Yes, and I had a case of that of a lady, fun enough, who the dog that she had been bought by her late husband. So this it was even more, so when her, it was like reminding her of him and still going on walks with the dog. And it was, so that was like still sort of part of him. And so when the dog died, she was devastated. And as you say, people say it was just a dog. But it's like, obviously been with her for, 14 years or whatever. And then it's just that extra pull from that loss from her husband. So it was very impactful, and it's just very miserable in the office, and people wonder what's the matter with you.
And so having this yourself, somebody like yourself in the business, to be able to assist with the policy and the gaps in the policy, helping to actually think about, how you're actually maybe fielding communications from people who need your help, etc. What are the benefits of doing this over the long term for your employees?
Well, you will have a happier and more productive workforce if they feel supported. I mean, you might think, oh, well, how many instances of loss are we going to have to deal with in our time? Well, you will have, because it's not, we know to say, because it's not just about, obviously grief and loss covers so many different things, and we've talked about life transitions. And of course you will, yes. I mean, if it comes down to finance, the bottom line and budgets, well, you'll have, because they're more productive and they're not going to be absent, and you won't have to keep recruiting people and you won't have to keep replacing lost staff. That's going to make a huge difference. And if you have consistency as well with the employees, and you don't lose particularly people who've been trained up and are very skilled, then you can imagine you're going to have a much more effective, thriving business than you would do if you keep people dropping out all the time. So, you know, and I think it's all about, it's I would say, from a sort of like a well-being perspective, to actually have a happier, healthier workforce generally. I mean, that cannot be a downside. It has to be an upside, right? So, we spend a lot of our time at work. And do you want miserable staff or do you want happy staff?
Well, thank you. I
Yeah.
think that's a great place to end on. And Celia, how can people get hold of you?
Well, you can find me through my website, which is yourrelationshipguru.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. And everybody listening, if you are going through a situation such as this, perhaps you are an employer who's finding it very difficult to cope because somebody has just suffered something which you hadn't expected, and business is really finding it tough to deal with, or in your employee and you need somebody to talk to, be in touch with Celia because she can be a great first step for you. Until next time, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, and see you all again very soon. Bye bye now.